Eskom will struggle to get coal to supply the country's electricity needs. All major coal producers have left or are said to be leaving the country. This means that the utility will have only 2 mines it can rely on. Adding to the problem is that India will stop importing coal by 2024. The country is the biggest importer of South African coal, and this will further hurt the coal mining industry. Well, joining us to unpack this and its implications is senior lecturer at the University of Pretoria, Tax. That's Mr. Matlo Kalaba. Matlo, good morning. Thank you very much for your time. It's not a good situation then if this picture is really what is happening, because then Eskom will find it extremely and increasingly difficult to source coal to supply us with power, because they have got coal-fired power stations.
Good morning, Dan. Yes, indeed, the situation is adding more uncertainty, more doubts about the future, possibility of ensuring that we have sufficient electricity in the country. And coal is actually the #1 resource where the whole of South Africa depend on when it comes to electricity. So it is really worrying.
Now, if the coal industry is facing a long-term decline from what we are seeing, the trends currently, how else then can Eskom sustain itself and ensure that you and I and millions of South Africans get power every day?
Well, there are 3 levels to this issue. The first thing is that when it comes to resources, underground, hence we're talking mining, there is no problem in terms of that. We have sufficient resources.
Underground?
Underground, yes. That Eskom has declared a number of times for another 200 years, actually. Then you have the second level, which we're discussing, which is now getting underground to get that coal. And we're talking now multi-billion capital expenditure to do so. And this is where now this exodus of international companies that are currently mining our coal are leaving. And there are a number of factors that contributed towards these companies announcing now that in 2024 and around 2030 they would stop mining in South Africa, in particular coal, not necessarily other minerals.
And one of them, I guess, I understand, is Glencore.
Yes.
Which is based in Switzerland, and has been seeing the decline in revenues. So going forward, they say, what's the point?
Exactly. One of them is Glencore, and there's another Indian company which is also a massive, they have massive operations. But the main drivers, or if I may just spend a few seconds discussing those, they are 3. The first one is that at international level, the drive to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions has actually made countries to start moving away from coal as a resource.
And companies, I know you're going to carry on, but companies like Glencore, like the Indian one, are also under pressure in their own countries to do their bit to improve the environment and reduce their carbon emissions. Precisely.
So countries and therefore companies are under pressure to move away from coal, to look for different operations. The second reason is that, so this agreement was signed internationally, and South Africa is one of the signatories of, the COP23, or what is referred to as Paris Agreement, which is the commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But for South Africa, coal is actually the leading emitter. So by signing that, indirectly, we have said we are going to start slowing down on this. But we followed that up with an actual policy implementation with the introduction of carbon tax. So carbon tax is actually a direct penalty for using emitting sources of energy, which, as I said, coal is the #1 resource for doing that.
So the drivers are really outside of South Africa's control. We've signed the international agreement, the Paris Agreement, but government still is making provision for more coal mines. I mean, there's like contradiction to me.
It sounds like that. It is really a policy misalignment, but at the same time, we're desperate then. We are really in a situation where, every time you hear the word load shedding, you know that it's not a good word, right? And our primary provider of electricity comes from that coal. So we are torn in this contest that while we're using an emitting resource, a polluting resource, at the same time, for now, maybe for the next 5 to 10 years, it is the only hope of having energy security.
From an analysis perspective, therefore, and just from that response, government then would have an opportunity, as the Glencores and the Indian companies of this world are departing, to create opportunity for local mine owners, or to create them for the next 5 to 10 years at least, while the transition is happening to cleaner energy, to mine the coal?
Yes, so a medium-term option is to do that, to have companies coming in. It's not like they're going to start a new mine. They'll probably take over the operations of the companies that are exiting. But they need to have this kind of term in mind of 5 to 10 years, or probably even 20. But then, because of the money, that is the capital requirements to invest in that, 20-year period might not be sufficient to cover all those costs. So those are some of the considerations. The alternative is what is currently not preferred in South Africa, which is go renewable, get IPPs coming in using solar, wind.
But that's a long-term game. I mean, if you look at other countries, even the Germanys of this world, they still have a small amount of their grid that's supplied by coal-fired power stations.
That's true. So it has to be transitioned in. It can't be a big bang implementation.
Is there an implication on this coal thing and the ability of Eskom to produce coal for us for the government's integrated resource plan? You know, they talk about this energy plan and the energy mix. What could this all mean then as the coal mining is reducing? And you can't rely, you can, but it is not ideal to rely on two mines to supply 70% of your coal supply to feed the grid.
It is too risky. It would, as I said, lead to these uncertainties and lack of stable supply, in which case the current situation of load shedding unannounced are to be expected. But you mentioned the IRPs, where in those policy statements, they do make it clear that a number of options have been considered, and over time, other sources of energy supply will come on board. But the time frames there, they are not in the sense that this new development is putting us under now. So they'll have to go back, work on the time frames of the IRP, and instead of slowly now moving away from coal, change the timelines, change the margins of how much will come from coal. But this leads us to that. To answer your question, if you can't rely on coal, then start building up for the alternative.
Thank you very much. That's a senior lecturer at the University of Pretoria, giving some of his insights there around the issue that Eskom is battling with now. The struggle to get coal is going to worsen. That's Mr. Matlo Kalaba.